Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. My name is Otto Svensson. I'm once again sitting in for Donatien Rui while she is enjoying her European vacation. Today, we will discuss the state of play in the brewing trade confrontation between the United States and the European Union. Then we will turn to a conversation with Noah Barkin, senior advisor with the Rhodium Group's China practice, to preview next week's EU-China summit. We hope you enjoy the show. So, Max, we're back in tariff inferno. Donald Trump has once again pressed the big red button, marked tariff threats that I'm sure he has installed in the Oval Office. On Saturday, he issued a letter to Commission President Ursula von der Leyen threatening to impose a 30% tariff on imports from Mexico and the European Union starting on August 1st. He noted in that letter that the European Union will allow complete open market access to the United States with no tariff being charged to us in an attempt to reduce the large trade deficit. In response, Ursula von der Leyen said that 30% tariffs would disrupt essential transatlantic supply chains to the detriment of business, consumers, and patients on both sides of the Atlantic. So until the middle of last week, Brussels was still hoping to conclude at least a framework for a deal that would imply that the EU would accept a base tariff of 10%, while it would push for carve-outs for key sectors. After these new demands, the Commission teed up sanctions package, $84 billion worth of U.S. goods, everything from Boeing aircraft to bourbon and cars, for possible tariffs if trade talks with Washington fail. And those tariffs will come into place on August 6th if nothing comes to pass. At the same time, you had Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, in Washington on Monday this week for another love.
Eventful Bastille Day.
It was an incredible, eventful Bastille Day. The French embassy here in Washington threw another great party, as they're wont to do.
After a biblical thunderstorm.
So you had this sort of confluence of vibes. Once again, you have looming trade threats. At the same time, there seems to be good progress on the security and defense dimension when it comes to transatlantic affairs. So what's next? We're 2 weeks away from Trump's August 1st tariff deadline. What's the state of play?
I think maybe to start on tariffs. Look, the EU has been treating this like a normal trade negotiation, number one, where they send their people in, we're going to try to have a win-win cooperation. And then what they sort of encountered, that this is basically a shakedown, that this is about the EU offering tribute, that's what the Trump administration is focused on, that you need to pay us for the fact that you've been running a trade deficit with the United States. And it took the EU negotiators a while to figure that out. And then what they saw is that the Brits sort of got this deal where it was 10% tariffs, and they thought, okay, that's probably as good as we can get. So we'll get something like that. And I think there was basically a deal that was agreed to that was, I don't think, quite as quote unquote good as what the Brits got. It's still kind of unclear how that deal would, what it would look like, but something along those lines. And then I think it had gone up to Trump, and then Trump responds with this letter and says, we're back to 30. And the economists in the EU would say, okay, retaliation doesn't really make sense economically. Okay, we'll take a 15 or 10% tariff rate. But if we put that on ourselves, well, that just makes everything more inefficient. That doesn't really help us. But this is like brass knuckles politics. And I think the problem is that no one takes the Europeans seriously. And so you have Mark Rutte on one hand at NATO bending the knee, calling Trump daddy, and he sort of did the same thing in the White House. And he's European. Like, we don't make a distinction. They're all European, EU, NATO, whatever. And so here's Europe looking incredibly weak, incredibly obsequious. And we're the bully that's going to steal your lunch money. And we're going to steal it today, and then we're going to steal it tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, until you actually gear up to punch us in the face. And then we'll be like, well, maybe we don't take your lunch money. And what the Europeans have been is like, we want to avoid a trade war. Maloney, the Italian luxury goods, German cars, all the Europeans are like, Ursula, please don't fight back. And I think what you have is a tale of two Europes. You have Ursula von der Leyen trying to be like, okay, Let's start punching. The EU for a year has set up a task force inside of the European Commission to think about how to punch the United States on trade, how to gear up for a trade war. What are the targets that they're going to hit? You mentioned some of them: Boeing, Bourbon, other sectors going to target red states. They have a battle plan. They're ready for war. And what you have then in response is all these weak ass member states being like, oh no, they might hit our sector. And so this is a classic case of, as one, Europe can be really strong and probably get something what China got, which is China hit back. And then suddenly there was a lot of Wall Street freak out. And then there was a deal that was probably more beneficial to China than the United States. So in my view, it's like the course here is either you act to defend yourself, but where we are is like the member states are like, well, maybe let's just give it another go. I do think it's a sign that it's shifting towards, well, we got to hit back. And that's why the EU has put out, this is what we're going to do on August 6th. And I think that's significant. It's not as strong, I think, as it could be, but it's at least a sign that something is moving, because the whole notion that Trump always chickens out actually turns out that really it was the Europeans that were always chickening out.
So let's play this out, these intra-EU squabbles. It has been reported that the Commission is teeing up this $84 billion worth of U.S. goods that will be targeted. You mentioned that there are divisions: German exporters, chemicals, cars, etc. The Italians rely a lot on exports to the U.S. as well. On the other hand, you have countries like Spain and France that are promoting, to take a tougher response. Who's going to come out on top in these conversations? Typically it's the Germans that sort of have their way when it comes to the EU's external trade strategy. But how is this going to play out?
Look, I think it's sort of a nightmare. And I think the Germans will get a little bit of their say. They can speak German to Ursula von der Leyen. But I think everyone's going to get a little bit and everyone's going to be disappointed. Ultimately, look, what we're talking about here for Europe would be bad if the US put 30% tariffs against Europe. And I think really the larger question here is, do you think that this is going to be the last bit of extraction that the Trump administration is going to ask for? Like, okay, let's say they get a deal on this. Well, in like 2 weeks, the Digital Services Act, there's the Digital Markets Act, then there's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Like, this is going to be again and again and again. And if you demonstrate to the Trump administration this is effective, they're going to keep doing it. So I think where we are is the Europeans are sort of coming around to recognizing this. Hence, they've had a bit stronger approach. But then the problem that they have is that then you have Mark Rutte, who is just utterly bending the knee, licking the boot, was here in Washington on Bastille Day. And he's getting a lot of credit in Europe as really, saving the day, helping the Ukrainians, keeping the United States in. And I'm asking, what has he actually gotten? Like, let's go back to the NATO summit. And we had this argument already, but let's go back to the NATO summit. Did he get a commitment from the United States to increase its defense spending? No, we were not part of that agreement. Did he get a commitment from the United States to keep its forces in Europe? Oh, no, he didn't get that agreement. Trump did sort of say some positive things about NATO. He said something about Article 5 and he sort of caveated, but I guess we're still in NATO. So I guess that's the win, is that America's still nominally in. And then this week, everyone's making a huge deal out of the agreement that Europeans would effectively buy American weapons for Ukraine. This is, I think, somewhat significant, but let's not overstate it, because we don't really quite know what this means. Let me walk you through that. The Biden administration had a ton of money. They got out the door to U.S. defense companies, and they were buying for Ukraine. So that would then come to the U.S. government, and then that would be shipped to Poland and then to Ukraine. But the U.S. government owns the weapon system, has already paid for it. Are they just paying us for old money, for money we've already spent? Are they just paying us back, so to speak, in air quotes, to continue deliveries? Or are they effectively putting together future weapons packages for Ukraine and then effectively buying U.S. aid for Ukraine? If you're Ukrainian, you don't really care. But the notion that this is some big win of the United States demonstrating its commitment to Ukraine, I'm a little bit like, no, we're not putting any money in the game. You are paying us. You are buying our weapon systems, something you've already done. So you're just spending a lot more. Okay, great. But this isn't some huge commitment. I think we really need to level set where we are and what Mark Rutte has actually delivered here by coming and what's actually come out of the NATO summit. Because my understanding is defense plans are working apace in the Pentagon to withdraw U.S. forces. So what did you get? I don't know.
I should say, maybe I can chime in here as the only European in the room and speak to whether or not I'm offended on behalf of Europeans as to, how Mark Rutte speaks about the alliance and about how Europeans feel about this Trump administration. I don't feel indignant at all. Whatever he has to do to keep the alliance intact, if that means going on Fox News and licking Donald Trump's boots, like, I don't care at all.
Yeah, but I think what needs to be recognized is that then he's playing into American domestic politics in a way that he, in some ways, in his New York Times interview, sort of refused to do. Oh my God, I'm not going to comment on things that Donald Trump is doing in his own domestic politics. But then he goes and praised Trump as making all these major deliverables and advances for NATO and being this great American president. So if I was a European, I'd be like, well, what are we doing all this bootlicking for? Why are we looking so weak and pathetic? And then I look at the trade side and I'm like, oh, okay, well, you're actually, I think, just reinforcing the perception that Europe is just totally divided, weak, and feckless.
I think that's one way to look at it. I think a metaphor that I'm starting to come around to when it comes to how Brussels is treating these negotiations with Washington is that of a boxer in the ring coming up against the heavyweight champion of the world, which, the US economy probably is if you had to peg that to one economic actor in the world, playing rope-a-dope, leaning against the ropes, trying to sort of absorb a little bit of economic damage in the short term. Yeah. Meanwhile, reaching out to partners globally and forging new trade relations. You had von der Leyen in Indonesia this week coming to terms on a framework agreement for an Indonesia-EU trade agreement. We've seen the same with Mexico, with Canada, with UAE, with India as well. So avoiding a trade confrontation with your biggest trade partner in the short term, trying to sort of mend those relationships as well as you can while you're wheeling and dealing globally, I think that's a pretty sound strategy.
I don't disagree. And this is where I think the European Commission deserves a ton of credit of actually trying to have a new strategy for this new world of looking for new trading partners to set up essentially perhaps a new bloc, a new trading bloc that centers around the EU. The EU going forth with Indonesia, CPTPP countries, with India. If it does that, you begin to create kind of a third trading bloc revolving around the EU, which I think a lot of other countries would then want to be part of and begin to harmonize standards and other things like that. I think when it comes to the United States, I think they're at 6s and 7s because they don't want the world to change. They want to keep the Americans in. And so hence that's the route to strategy. And what I haven't seen, we talked about this, but a lot of defense spending, but not a lot of defense cooperation, not really facing, I think, the new world that it confronts them on the security side. But I think, that new world is coming. I think when the force posture is going to be announced probably in the fall. And I think that is where I think the security side wake up will begin to happen. I think Trump respects strength, and I just get no strength right now from Europe, and I think that's coming. And if that comes, I think that can put US-EU relations in a better place. The other thing that happened just today as we're recording on Wednesday, July 16th, is the announcement of the EU's new multi-annual financial framework. That's just the fancy Eurospeak word for the EU's budget, which is 7 years and is not going to be put in place until I think 2028. But the fight begins. The bell has been rung. There's a lot of confusion about what's involved. The one thing I'd say about this, what Merz is kind of pro-EU European pivot that he has made, or at least rhetorically. When are we going to see that in terms of tangible policy announcements? Because von der Leyen needs a bigger budget. The EU needs a bigger budget to deal with defense, to deal with competitiveness, also to deal with its energy crisis and climate issues. So it needs a bigger budget, but no one wants to give the EU more money. But they all want it to have a bigger budget, but then they don't want to make any cuts to agriculture sector. So there's just a lot of happy talk right now coming from Berlin about Europe and no real policy agenda.
To sort of encapsulate that view that you just laid out, where there is this view, particularly amongst sort of the center-left moderate crowd in many European capitals that, we want a bigger budget, we don't really want to pay into it, and we don't really want to get specific about what we're interested in cutting.
And then when the EU proposes to have its quote-unquote own resources or basically levy EU tax on things like tobacco, everyone freaks out. Oh no, you can't empower it that way. So it's a classic case of Europe needs a center to do pan-European things, to provide European public goods, but then struggles to figure out how to pay for that.
And, the top line figure from the budget draft that was announced today is that it's going to increase from 1.1% of EU GNI to 1.15% of GNI. So a very minuscule increase. The noteworthy thing, though, is that it introduces a 30% cut to EU agricultural subsidies, which if you ever need to give the French farmers an excuse to protest, this is it.
French, Polish, Italian farmers unite.
Yeah, so that's definitely something to
Lots
watch.
of tractors going to be coming into Brussels pretty soon.
Yeah, so this is a budget fight that will play out over the next, years, because we're still some years away from 2028. Definitely something we will track here on the podcast as well. I think that's a good opportunity to pivot to our conversation with Noah Barkin.
We are thrilled to welcome Noah Barkin to the Eurofile. Noah is a senior advisor with Rhodium Group's China practice, focusing on Europe-China relations and transatlantic China policy. He's one of the foremost experts, not just on China, but on all things European relations with China. And so he's the best person to talk to, I think, heading into what will be the EU-China summit coming in a couple weeks' time towards the end of July. Noah, welcome to the show. Great to have you back.
Great to be here, Max. Thanks for the invitation.
Noah, maybe you could set the stage a bit. There is a summit scheduled on July 24th between the EU and China, and it will be in Beijing. It was originally supposed to be, my understanding, a 2-day summit. Now it looks like it may only be a 1-day summit. What prompted this summit? Set the stage a bit about what is happening, what is supposed to happen in the next couple of weeks.
Sure. Well, I think if you go back first of all, the EU and China hold summits normally every year, and that it doesn't happen. In some years, it didn't happen in 2024, but there was a summit back in December of 2023. That was the last one. So it's not unusual that the EU and China would be holding a summit. And I think if you went back a few months ago, it looked like when this summit, when they decided to hold this summit, it looked like the EU and China were potentially moving closer together. And one of the drivers of that, of course, was the arrival of Donald Trump. And European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, back at the World Economic Forum in Davos back in January, I think it was the same day that Trump re-entered the White House, kind of opened the door to a closer economic relationship with China. This was a sort of departure. Von der Leyen was known as sort of Europe's main hawk on China, but there was a bit rhetorical pivot. And then we saw China back in April, I think it was, or at the end of March, lift sanctions on EU lawmakers that it had put back in place in 2021. And, it was against this backdrop that the two sides decided to hold this summit at the end of July. But I think the tone over the past couple months, I would say, has changed. And there are a number of reasons for that. One, the controls that China put on rare earths, which were ostensibly targeted at the US, but hit European companies very hard. And there was a real panic. If you go back to a month ago, companies in the car sector, in the medical devices sector, in the defense sector were running out of these rare earths. This is also an issue in the United States, of course.
Can I just interject there? Why did China retaliate against the EU for the US-initiated trade war? Were European companies just sort of included randomly, or was this a deliberate effort by China sort of saying we don't really differentiate between the US and Europe? Why was Europe included in this rare earth attack, so to speak?
Well, it was, I think, China took a global approach. It wasn't only Europe, it was Japan and many other trading partners. And one reason could have been that they didn't want rare earths being sent to Europe and then passed on to the US. So that, I think, was one reason. But, China deliberately made the decision to make this not just about the US. And the messages that Chinese officials sent in the early weeks of these controls, when the Europeans started complaining that they were not getting these rare earths, was that, okay, we have bureaucratic problems, we implemented this measure, and it's going to take time to work through the backlog, etc. But at the same time, they were also linking these controls or a loosening of the controls to other things like withdrawal of electric vehicle duties on Chinese EVs that Brussels put in place last year, or a loosening of European technology controls to China. So very soon, this began to be seen in European capitals as a sort of coercive measure. And I think a key point was when Ursula von der Leyen at the G7 summit back in June in Canada issued a very critical statement of China, accusing it of coercion, accusing it of blackmail. And this, along with a few other measures that the EU took, including Chinese banks on a Russian sanctions list, using its procurement instrument to ban Chinese medical device makers from the EU market, this really created a sort of escalation with China. And when Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, came through Europe at the beginning of this month, he canceled the second day of this summit.
So when I'm in Europe and in talking to Europeans, it seems that there's sort of two different views. And neither of these views, I think, are espoused by China experts in China hands. But one is sort of the foreign policy view of the US is quitting Europe. Therefore, Europe can turn back to China, can sort of hedge and sort of occupy a kind of third pole where Europe should turn back to China, try to have an economic relationship. There's a lot that can be done with China on climate and other issues. And then there's a kind of economists that look at the Chinese economy and say, oh, no, you can't turn to China because they're going to eat our lunch. China is becoming a clean tech superpower, is a clean tech superpower, as is Europe. Europe is an export powerhouse, which is, Donald Trump's complaint. So is China. And that the real threat to the European economy is not so much US tariffs, but Chinese dumping into Europe's economy. So there is no ability for Europe to pivot to Beijing. And I've been hearing kind of those two camps playing out, the kind of foreign policy hand that I would put myself in, knowing nothing about economics, and then the economist sort of knowing little about the foreign policy side. And it strikes me the economists probably have more accurate there. But I'm curious if that is playing out in Europe and if you see it as kind of a current fight between those two poles and what's coming out of that.
Yeah, I mean, Europe is 27 countries, so you will always have divergences in approach. And I think, you have on one end Hungary, which has been very cozy with China. I think over the past year, we've also seen a country like Spain looking at China opportunistically and seeking Chinese investment and perhaps not being willing to criticize China in a sort of forthright way. But I would say that this is sort of the minority view. I would say that the emerging consensus in Europe is that China poses more of an economic threat than representing an economic opportunity for Europe. Of course, European countries, especially Germany, where I live, did great business in China in recent decades. But you have a whole slew of German industries that have begun to suffer. So starting with steel, solar, wind, chemicals increasingly, machine tools, and of course cars, which are car makers in Germany are heavily dependent on the Chinese market. So they are reluctant to see the relationship turn in a more confrontational direction. But I think there are increasing concerns in various big European capitals, obviously Brussels, Berlin, Paris, the Netherlands, and The Hague. But I think one key question is how the new German government positions itself, because Germany, I think, is key. It has the closest economic relationship with China, the deepest investments in China. It's a manufacturing powerhouse, which is, in a way, has benefited the most from China's growth, but at the same time is the most threatened by China's emergence as a manufacturing hub.
And how do you see the new German government approaching China? It seemed that when Olaf Scholz would go to China, he'd bring huge business delegations, that the German car companies, which had in some ways become quasi-Chinese car companies by the nature of their business models, had a lot of influence, especially over an SPD-led government. Do you see a more hawkish line coming from Merz? And this is an EU-China summit. The Germans are very important in shaping any collective EU policy. Is that contributing to perhaps a more sour tone to this summit than perhaps might have been a couple years ago?
Well, I think we're still reading the tea leaves on the new German government when it comes to China. I think they came into office just a couple months ago, and they've had their hands full with Russia, with ramping up defense spending. Last month, we had G7 summit. We had a NATO summit. They've had to cobble a budget together. So I think China hasn't been front and center in Berlin. And I've had a number of conversations with people just in the past week. And I think the consensus is the jury is still out. But there are some signals. I think Merz is clearly much more outspoken and critical on China than his predecessor, Olaf Scholz. He gave a speech before the election where he lumped China together with Russia, Iran and North Korea in an axis of autocracies. He warned German companies about the risks of investing in China. This is not something that you would have heard from Scholz. He's also, I think, focusing on European unity much more than Scholz did. So he traveled to Paris, traveled to Warsaw on his first day as chancellor, and he's signaled that he wants to make a transition from what was really a Germany first approach to China to more of a Europe first approach. We'll see how that works out in concrete terms. Implementation will be key, and Germany has different interests than a country like France. But that is positive, and I would say it's positive some of the appointments that he's made. His Europe advisor, Michael Klaus, was German ambassador to the EU for the past 7 years, and before that he was German ambassador to China for 5 years. So you have Chinese expertise in the inner circle, in Merz's inner circle, which is something I don't think we could say about Olaf Scholz or Angela Merkel, that they had real China experts sitting in the chancellery next to them.
Now, maybe you could talk a little bit about what is China's approach here? During the first Trump administration, it felt like China really squandered an opportunity to build really robust ties with Europe. I mean, I guess the end of the first Trump administration did end with Angela Merkel as sort of leading the EU to sign a trade and investment agreement with China, which subsequently got put on hold by the sanctions that China put in place on European lawmakers, as you mentioned at the beginning of the interview. But that China's sort of wolf warrior diplomacy, really aggressive approach to European countries, to me, seems to really backfire. And that I could see a China approaching Europe now very nervous about its future relationship with the United States. China has been very eager to sort of elevate the term strategic autonomy because it views it as in its interest to kind of create a division in transatlantic relations, but to try to exploit that. And when Wang Yi went to the Munich Security Summit earlier this year, he talked about how China believes in a rules-based international order, not a liberal rules-based international order, but a rules-based one. And so I'm curious, I mean, it would strike me that China has a real diplomatic opportunity here. And do you see them taking steps or posture to make concessions or try to meet the Europeans halfway on certain issues? What is China's posture here?
Well, I would agree with you, Max, that China has had opportunities to drive a wedge between Europe and the US during the first Trump administration, also to a lesser extent during the Biden administration. But from a European perspective, I think all the steps that China has taken in Europe's direction have been very empty, symbolic steps. So removing the sanctions on EU lawmakers, which were introduced in 2021, I think there may have been some expectation in Beijing that this would maybe get the comprehensive agreement on investment going again. But Europe has really moved on from that. And there's a degree of promise fatigue with China. I think we saw towards the end of the Obama administration, beginning of the first Trump administration, a shift. The US no longer believed what China was saying. And I think Europe, with some delay, is now in that spot. And I'm not saying everyone is there, but certainly if you talk to people in Brussels at the top of the European Commission, they are there. So they, and this takes us back to the upcoming summit, they want tangible results. They don't want a nice flowery joint statement which says we all believe in the multilateral order and we all believe in a global trading system. They want tangible measures from China. And the problem is China has not been willing to take these because they would require changes to its economic model, which is certainly since the bursting of the property bubble, reliance on manufacturing and producing products in China that Chinese consumer cannot buy up and exporting those abroad. So this is seen as a threat to Europe, and Europe is beyond the point where it's willing to take promises from China at face value, and it wants to see tangible measures, and that just hasn't happened.
Yeah, I heard one senior U.S. official once remark to me that we, the United States, have a real struggle to understand Europe. Just imagine how confused the Chinese are. But I want to maybe, I want to maybe turn to Ukraine and Russia, because it strikes me actually over the last few weeks, I've been somewhat surprised that suddenly Chinese support for Russia, and maybe suddenly is overstating it, but China's support for Russia, at least from a defense industrial perspective, seems to have really been put on the agenda by senior European leaders. Perhaps no surprise, Kaja Kallas, as the High Representative for Foreign Policy for the European Union, was a major topic, I guess, in her conversation with Wang Yi, and there was a big story coming out of that, noting that Wang Yi said said that basically they wouldn't let China fail or wouldn't let Russia fail. And von der Leyen just gave sort of a very fiery speech, both calling out Chinese trade practices, but also Chinese support for Russia. Now, in the Biden administration, the final year, it was pretty clear that the White House thought that the EU might have some leverage over China here. You had Janet Yellen and other Treasury secretaries or other members of the Treasury Department saying, hey, you should call out Chinese support for Russia, not just focus on EVs and other things like that. What do you make of the current injection of China support for Russia? Is this going to really complicate the summit? Is this intentionally put out there to sort of sidetrack the summit? Or is this sort of an effort to really call out China for what it's doing and hopefully to get them to dial it back a bit? What are you kind of assessing here when it comes to China's support for Russia?
Well, it's hard to underestimate, I think, the impact that China's support for Russia has had on the EU-China relationship. And I think after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, there was a period where we heard European officials encouraging China to intervene with Vladimir Putin. And I think it was Joseph Borrell, the high representative, the EU's top diplomat, who at some point was saying, China can mediate in this conflict and encouraging China to take a bigger role. But I think more than 3 years later, what European officials have witnessed is an ever closer relationship between China and Russia. I mean, I don't know how many times Xi Jinping has been to Moscow and Putin to Beijing since the war started, but it's a significant number. In the meantime, Xi has only spoken to Vladimir Zelensky once, I think, on the phone. And I think we're also seeing growing evidence of Chinese economic support for Russia and the export of dual-use technologies that are being used on the battlefield in Ukraine. So this has been a topic in the EU-China relationship ever since Russia's invasion, but I think it's becoming a growing source of concern. I think in part because there are concerns naturally that the US is pulling back from supporting Ukraine, and that makes China's support for Russia even more of an acute concern for Europe. So I expect this to be a big topic at the EU-China summit, just as it was during Wang Yi's visit to Brussels, to Berlin, and to Paris, where I think the messages were very coordinated between those three capitals before Wang Yi came. So I think the EU will put this at the very top. This, combined with the growing concerns about the economic relationship, the imbalances in the trade relationship, I think indicate that it's going to be very difficult to reach some sort of rapprochement or diplomatic truce between the EU and China, and that Trump's arrival in a way does not make this more likely. It makes Europe's problems with China more acute, both Russia, as I just explained, but also trade diversion, as U.S. tariffs increase and Chinese exports are diverted into Europe. So I'm quite pessimistic about the EU-China relationship. I think the EU-China summit will not deliver much. And I think we're heading towards a period of growing trade tensions between the EU and China.
So you preempted my final question there, Noah, and what you sort of expect to come out of the summit. So it seems you expect not much, and that EU-China trade tensions at the very least, and I think diplomatic tensions to increase from it. Are there any surprises that you're looking for from the summit? And maybe one final question. So if that foreign policy hand that I mentioned earlier, and there is no real pivot to China, does this mean that the EU is then going to try to turn to other markets, a Mercosur trade agreement, which is, looks like it's approaching the finish line, but maybe CPTPP becoming closer to other Asian trading partners? Where do you see the EU going if there's going to be clear tension in EU-China relations going forward? So any surprises from the summit, and what's next for Europe, sort of after the summit, if they're not going to be able to play that China card?
I don't think we'll get any big surprises from the summit, but I think we could see some movement on climate, joint movement on climate between the EU and China. There are a number of EU commissioners in China right now, they're heading there early next week, including Teresa Ribera and Hoekstra, the climate commissioner, trying to work out something with China. Of course, the COP is coming up in November. The U.S. leadership in climate has vanished under Trump. And so I think there is perhaps some momentum, but the EU is pushing for China to take concrete steps and not just put out a feel-good statement on this. I don't think you can ever rule out that China could decide in the next few weeks to make some concessions to the EU. We saw that with the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, back at the end of 2020, when, a month before that deal, no one thought it was going to come together. And then just in the last couple of weeks, towards the end of 2020, Xi Jinping decided he wanted this deal and made some moves. So I don't think you can completely rule that out. I would say it's very unlikely. I think the EU's strategy is, as you say, to look to other markets, to diversify. That's a function of growing trade tensions with China. It's a function of growing trade tensions with the United States. So we have seen the EU, you mentioned Mercosur, but there are also talks with India going on, with Indonesia, Thailand, Australia has been going on for a while. And what's new is this discussion about the EU linking up with CPTPP. I think we're at an early stage. These talks are not advanced by any means, but we've heard Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, talk about this on a number of occasions. And I think we're going to see Europe push in that direction. If you talk to some other Asian countries like Japan, there's an EU-Japan summit coming up just before the EU-China summit. So I would be looking at that as a signal about Europe's sort of diversification push. So that is the partner side of the EU strategy. So increasing partnerships, diversifying its economic relationships. I think where the work really needs to be done is more on the protection side, protecting critical infrastructure, reducing dependencies. We've seen that with the impact of the Chinese rare earth controls, that this had a massive impact on Europe. So this is where the work really needs to be done. And a final thought, I think it really needs to be led increasingly by the big member states. I think the Commission has done a very good job in recent years of trying to herd the horses, so to speak, but they've led the horses to water and now the horses have to drink. So I would like to see Germany, France, the Netherlands, and a handful of other countries pushing a de-risking agenda from the ground up rather than waiting for the Commission to push this agenda from Brussels.
Well, Noah, thanks so much for this overview. It's been super helpful. We may have to call you back, especially if there's any big surprises coming from the summit. I'll just note, I have heard that I think on climate, I do think that there's effort to try to make some sort of breakthroughs, particularly as the EU looks like it's going to be implementing CBAM at the beginning of the new year, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And there's some sense that may provide a forcing mechanism within the Chinese system to get even further action on climate. So I could see something on climate, but I think I totally agree with you. That doesn't look like China has really changed its shirts in terms of how it's postured towards the summit. And in some ways, the EU has been quite, at least in my perspective, quite impressive in how firm it's been in heading into the summit, probably much more firm than it's been toward the United States in the current trade disputes. But that's a topic for another conversation. Noah, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll hope to have you back sometime soon on the Eurofile.
Thanks so much, Max.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.